This is a very unusual opera, and so I want to really thank you all for coming. In your shoes, I wouldn't have done the same thing. And this is an unpronounceable name in an opera that most opera goers have never heard of. The irony, of course, is that this is the most discussed, most written about, most studied, unperformed opera in the repertory. Now, that is a very important point to remember, that this is not an obscure opera that was taken off the shelf by us in some kind of fit of musicological enthusiasm. This is an opera about which everyone has known, whose score was published, and who had a performance history, a very modest one. The last American performance, to our best of our knowledge, is in 1914 at the Metropolitan Opera under the direction of Arturo Toscanini. So Arturo Toscanini and Gustav Mahler were the last real patrons of this opera from the early 20th century. And the opera has been pilloried in the literature even by its scholars. No one has ever criticized the music, but opera is not purely, as you know, a musical form. It is a dramatic, visual experience, and much of what we think about opera is in retrospect. That is, it's through the lens of Richard Wagner, backwards, and through the lens of Puccini, backwards. So it is, and through the lens also of musical theater. And therefore, what makes a great opera is not only a great score, a great story, then the operas that are done over and over again, they're not content to leave the story and the music alone, and then they do a dramaturgy, and they put an 18th century subject into a diner, and they turn knights or dwarves into businessmen. And that's understandable because they want to make the opera more accessible to a modern public. In an unperformed opera, the task on our part is actually to give the opera a chance it hasn't had previously, which I think Kevin Newbury's done terrifically and with a terrific cast. So I want to begin by saying that the opera, when it was first produced in 1823 in Vienna, was not simply a failure. I'm going to read an entry from the diary of the greatest dramatist and poet of the 1820s in Vienna, Franz Grillparzer. He was the person who also wrote the funeral oration at the death of Beethoven and the author of the epitaph on Schubert. He was an extremely literate amateur musician, great connoisseur of music, a friend of Beethoven's, and an important, very decisively important figure in Viennese culture and letters. This is from his diary. He writes, "Yesterday at Euryanthe, this music is disgusting." He underlines this. "This inversion of euphony, this rape of the beautiful, would have been punished by the state in the good old days of ancient Greece. Such music is illegal. It would create monsters were it ever possible that it gradually could find general acceptance. This opera can only please fools or lunatics or scholars or street thieves and assassins." Now, Grillparzer did not write this for publication. This is in his own diary. Now, so I want to start by trying to imagine what made him so angry. So this is a revolutionary work. What Weber did was to try to write an opera which is, in a way, the first modern musical prose. The switch from a kind of opera that's structured by poetic interludes, arias, duets, ensembles, as you would hear in Mozart, with spoken or cembalo, harpsichord accompanied recitative. So the story is advanced by Don Giovanni telling Leporello, let's do this, and then he sings. Now, he sings something that is about what he's feeling or what he's about to do, and what he sings is structured in a musical way that met the aesthetic expectations of the audience. The audience in 1820 was an extremely literate amateur audience with very strong views about musical beauty and musical form. And they viewed the musical experience as a parallel formal experience, which means symmetry, certain kinds of harmonic expectations, melodic structure, and particularly in Vienna with the prominence of Beethoven until 1815, a certain kind of expectation of development, thematic work. And this was also an audience that understood keys. This opera has a very distinct tonal plan. So whether things are in B major or they are in E flat major or they are in A flat major makes a real difference and made a real difference to the audience. People heard keys the way we see colors. And keys had meanings, had associations. Now, this has all been much changed. But so the audience had an idea of what they thought was musically beautiful. Grillparzer, quite a conservative view. So what was shocking about this is first that Weber decided. Weber was a very unusual man to begin with. He was born in 1786. He lived until the age of 40. He was quite sick for most of his life. He had an extremely ambitious father, a kind of latter-day Leopold Mozart. He was a wonderful pianist by all accounts, although there's some controversy about that. He was a fantastic conductor, one of the first to use a baton. He had a terrific career all over Europe. I mean, very peripatetic career. He actually wrote a book about advice for traveling musicians. He was partly a critic, but he did a tremendous amount of repertory, operatic repertory, as a conductor. He was an extremely experienced operatic conductor, overwhelmingly operatic conductor. He was an all-around musician. And he wrote all kinds of music, not only opera, dramatic music, sacred music, chamber music, songs. And but he was very devoutly Catholic, which is important to understand this opera. And so what he wanted to do was he believed, he was quite conservative, actually, as a composer. So his idol was Mozart in a way. He went to see Beethoven while he was preparing for the rehearsals for this, and all accounts that Beethoven was very enthusiastic about him. He was a little skeptical himself about Beethoven. What he wanted to do was to write music that revealed emotions and feeling. He also wanted music that would be expressive of daily experience and also of language. So if a character said, I'm feeling sad, and then I feel happy, the transition from sad to happy would be somehow reflected in the musical language, a kind of continuous musical prose. If you think it sort of sounds vaguely like the Gesamtkunstwerk sort of idea that Wagner has, you're absolutely right. Wagner helped kill the reputation of this opera by embracing it. He killed Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn. By the way, Weber was friendly with Meyerbeer. He killed them by hate and anti-Semitism. This he killed by embrace. He was largely responsible for the reburial of Weber's remains from London to Germany in 1844. And he helped give the idea, which is visible and audible in this opera as well, that Weber was a kind of first forerunner of nationalism, German nationalism. Now, Weber lived in an extremely violent and difficult time with the Napoleonic Wars and a tremendous amount of violence that was succeeded by an extremely repressive regime after the Congress of Vienna. And he, from our standards, lived a very unstable life, although a lot of his last years of his life were basically centered in Dresden, which is the only city which has liked this opera. It's the only city. So in Euryanthe, he decided he was going to experiment. He's going to take music and make it an illustrative, narrative art form. So, for example, you all opera goers know, for example, La Ci daran la mano from Don Giovanni, or you know the Champagne aria from Don Giovanni. You could put other words in there and you would enjoy it, right? You could put other words. You could have a sort of a dialogue between a married couple after many years wanting to pass the butter in La Ci daran la mano. If it worked in the sort of the melody-text relationship, actually what they're singing, it's sort of, yes, it sounds seductive, but it's just a beautiful tune, which is why people took La Ci daran la mano and wrote variations on it that had nothing to do with Zerlina and Don Giovanni. They extracted the melody and they made variations. So Weber said we need to take the next step. And in that sense, he was a romantic. He was not particularly a German nationalist. Most of his repertory as a conductor was Italian and French. Actually, he thought German opera ought to take the best of the French and the best of the Italian and sort of make something new. And what was new was to have this dramatic experience that used the musical learning that was German, that came through Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, put it to use dramatically in a continuous musical fabric. So you'll see that although there are duets and arias, there are numbers, the music continues along, unbroken. The recitative, the story is advanced, the dialogue between the characters has musical accompaniment and has little thematic units. You'll hear a very early one, you'll hear the words im Mitternacht, in exactly the words and the intervals that Gustav Mahler takes for his famous song At Midnight. So he's the first person to experiment in this way with what you would call leitmotivic ideas. In the overture, you'll see a pantomime, a tableau vivant, which was Weber's idea. So don't get angry at the director, because this story depends on a pre-story. If you don't know what the pre-story is, the whole story seems slightly incomprehensible. So he advised, and that's why in the overture you will see the first iteration of what's called the ghost music. And the ghost music returns. And finally, it is transformed into C major when the happy ending happens and the hero and the sort of the cleansing of the ring and the redemption of the soul of Emma, and there's a happy ending, the same music comes back. And you have been sitting, unless you left at the intermission, you've been sitting through the whole opera, and you actually have now heard this music, and you can identify. Using music as a kind of psychological, continuous tool of remembrance and of the argument of the story and of the text. Now, the supertitles are translated in sort of the libretto style. Now, the reason this opera has been even criticized by its defenders as unstageable. So what we are doing, the reason it hasn't been performed since 1914 in the United States, most people think it just isn't any good. Or it's a beautiful car, but it doesn't run. Looks great, I love to sit in it, but it doesn't move. I've always been suspicious of this kind of official wisdom. I'm not quite sure it's right. And since Toscanini and Mahler had the same suspicion, I'll take their word for it. Now, Mahler tried to change it. He was one of many people who tried to fiddle with the libretto. Because, first of all, the libretto had a ghost in it, which really doesn't sing, and it's still confusing. Get rid of the ghost. Then in the third act, which has always been criticized, there's a snake, and no one knows why the snake is there, and everything sort of happens happily ever after, but there's no reason it happens happily ever after. There's no real development. It's implausible. It's sort of stupid, and therefore it's dramatically unsuccessful. So he cut some of the third act music and interposed some of the second act music, and the fiddling doesn't work. There are various people who try to rewrite the libretto and keep the music intact. Now, Weber was very bitter about the sort of failure of this opera. Some people Goethe didn't like it, But Ludwig Tieck loved it. I mean, these are German writers. There are people who thought it was great, but they were somewhat in the minority. One of the reasons it's been hammered to death, in my opinion, is that the librettist was a woman, which was actually really unusual. And he took some criticism for it. And of course, all the arrogant men, after Weber's death, thought, she's just a woman, we can do this better. I actually don't think so. And I think the libretto was the occasion for great music on Weber's part. And it's part of the function of a libretto. One could argue the greatest of the Verdi librettos is by Piave, not actually Boito and Shakespeare, but is, even the libretto of Rigoletto is not high literature. It is a fabulous medium for a great piece. And of course, Wagner thought himself as a poet, which I think is entirely implausible. One of the mysteries for a historian is to see intelligent people sitting for hours hearing Wagner read the text of The Ring, which is an embarrassment as far as I'm concerned, both in terms of literature and ideology. And finally, if you're going to start taking operas apart for the ludicrousness of the story, let's start with the opera that without this opera is unthinkable, and that's Lohengrin. Euryanthe, Elsa is a less attractive version of Euryanthe. Telramund and Ortrud are Lysiart and Eglantine, and there's König Heinrich is our king, and it's actually, and Wagner looked at this opera with great, great care as a kind of damaged precursor to his own achievement. And we are unable to stop thinking that way. So in the effort to restore this, what Mahler did, for example, was to get rid of the supernatural elements, the ghost and the snake. The snake is a little odd, and they don't do well on stage, snakes. And that's why, Wagner was smart. He put the Fafner, when, the giants, transform themselves. He's off stage. You don't see him in Siegfried. That would have been, Wagner was smart enough not to do that. In this case, there's supposedly a snake on stage. But when we decided to do this opera, and we do it because Schubert didn't like it either. Schubert apparently told Weber there are no tunes here. So now you have two very smart people who think one thought it was disgusting and it was illegal. And if we gave a poll when you exited this, whether you think this music should be banned, I don't think a single person would vote in that direction. Not even they didn't like it, or that it is disgusting. No, you might think the worst thing. You think it's it's early 19th century music. It's just a little bit too pretty, perhaps. It's not as dark as our HBO shows are, and so it's doesn't hold our attention. It's a little naive, perhaps, but not disgusting. Weber thought it had no melodies, no tunes. He agreed with Grillparzer. Now, he was jealous because what happened to Weber is that he had one big success with Freischütz. Freischütz's opera was premiered in 1921 in Berlin, came to Vienna, and was revolutionary. The two things that annoyed Beethoven, he had respect for Weber, but he had no respect for Rossini and less for Paganini and the sort of new Italian wave of lightweight music, Rossini particularly, which was a craze in post-1815, 1820 Vienna. And Freischütz was also a real hit. It was a new idea of music. So, it wasn't the old classical tradition, although Weber was in that tradition. And Weber doesn't have a particular style. Weber is an extremely eclectic composer in many ways, and a great composer. So, in a way, this Freischütz success really was a kind of trouble for Weber, because he then had to sort of come up with a second hit. He had a great first novel in a way, although he had written many operas before. This was his real first great hit. Freischütz doesn't play well in the United States. It's done an awful lot in German-speaking Europe. There's a French version which was very successful that Weber didn't much like. The same person tried to do one with Euryanthe as well. But You know, if you think this story is incomprehensible, Freischütz is entirely incomprehensible unless you're a student of feudal land rights, which is not a common topic in the United States. And you know, a very close friend of mine once made the very powerful observation that there's nobody on stage you like in Freischütz. Agathe, Max, they're all really unattractive people, and they're usually carrying guns. And I thought, in modern America, this is not a great idea, and so we'll dispense with it. I also think this is much greater piece musically, but you will see in the third act there is a hunter's chorus, because the audience, Weber, we wanted to evoke his success with Freischütz, but he really took a different turn with this piece. He wanted to walk away from sort of repeating himself in that regard, which Weber didn't do a lot of. He borrowed from himself a fair amount, but he didn't repeat himself. So to sum up and then turn the floor over to you for questions. So this is, in my judgment, a truly great opera and very successful on the stage. We have kept it intact. We have a ghost, and we have a snake, if you will, metaphorically treated, but I think persuasively. Our thought was, you know, for those of us who travel a lot, we're often on airplanes, and for those of us who can't work on an airplane, we sort of watch the video entertainment. This is my only contact with Game of Thrones. And I have never understood a thing about it. I don't understand the characters, I don't understand the plot. It's wildly successful. And one episode, which I didn't see to the end, there are some baby dragons in it. So I was looking at one of these, incomprehensible to me. And then there's also Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I figured, in our culture, what's wrong with a snake? You know, who has to justify it? Or a ghost? If vampires can be a real serious source of commercial entertainment, we can put up with a ghost. So finally, the last thing I would say is that the opera is based on a premise which we, as modern, for 21st century individuals, will find a little hard to understand. And that is, this is about secret keeping. And since we live in an age where we can no longer keep any secrets, somebody's always listening, and you can't erase anything you've done. This is a dying premise. And whereas Wagner takes the idea into Lohengrin to absolutely diminish the character of the female, of the feminine, Elsa is responsible for the health of her state, not only her own personal happiness, and she can't keep a secret that's made in public that will protect her life, her honor, and the happiness of her state. Whatever you think of Lohengrin, it is a terrible portrait of females, Ortrud and Elsa. And this idea in this opera, because she's accused of bewitching her brother, the rightful heir. Wagner gets this idea from Euryanthe, but Euryanthe is a much more touching. So the secret is that Emma commits suicide. And that's Adelar's sister. Now, for us, the idea of suicide as a mortal sin, of a sin that where the soul cannot be taken into heaven, is only really emotionally accessible to those who are deeply religious. For Weber, the other thing that Weber, of course, is very important is the Catholicism and the deep moralism. Weber was a deeply moralistic individual, although he spent some time in jail. We won't go into that. He did have a kind of spiritual transformation. It was for money. It was nothing moral. In that, I don't really mean that. But not that embezzlement doesn't deserve a moral criticism. But he thought this was going to be about true love, honor, and the triumph of the good over the evil. This is an opera about good and evil. And Emma taking her own life in a fit of overcome with grief, was a dark secret which would have dishonored Adelar, his family, and his status at court, and also left the soul of his beloved sister in limbo and in a kind of terrifying state, similar to the ghost of Marley in Dickens's Christmas Carol, dragging her sins without being released from the terror between heaven and earth. So the secret that he tells Euryanthe is a secret which is deeply personal. It's not political. It's not a political secret. And the terms of release of the secret, which is dependent on her purity and virginity, and the tears of a virgin, and to release the soul of Emma, she confides this terrible in a woman who represents herself as her friend, and then proceeds to betray her. It's a perfectly interesting plot. It's about friendship and betrayal, which is a common experience for all of us. And it's about telling people a secret and they're not keeping it, and then the terrible consequences of doing so. And in the end, Euryanthe is a character we identify with. And she is both heroic and generous and forgiving, not like Elsa. And that's in part what attracted Weber, why he decided to use Helmina as a librettist. So it's not arbitrary that a woman wrote this, because the characterization of the female here in its heroine is deeply attractive. She's strong, she's brave, she's courageous, and what she did wrong is utterly human. She didn't actually fail to keep her nerve. So I think this is a dramatically persuasive opera. The music is of uncommon beauty and uncommon consistency. It's a different aesthetic from Puccini and Wagner, but that's good. It's also a different aesthetic from Mozart. There's a lot, he knew his music, so many of you will recognize the sources in a way, but it's distinctly his own pen.